What if the cure for one of humanity's most dreaded diseases was not a product of gleaming laboratories and billion-dollar research, but a secret whispered through centuries, a remedy writhing in the shadowed corners of ancient medicine? Tonight, we delve into a story that blurs the line between miracle and monstrosity, a tale of a revolutionary cancer treatment and the chilling discovery that followed. The answers we found will shock you. So, before we pull back the curtain on this horrific truth, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single second of this. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day already thick with the humid despair of a New Orleans summer. Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose brilliance was now only a footnote to his disgrace, stared at the crisp, cream-colored envelope. It was an anomaly in the usual pile of final notices and thinly veiled threats from debt collectors that littered the sticky surface of his coffee table. His apartment was a mausoleum to his dead career, the air a stagnant cocktail of stale whiskey and regret, his medical textbooks lying dormant, gathering a thick shroud of dust. The return address, a place he hadn't allowed himself to think of in years, sent a jolt of unwelcome electricity through his languid misery. A post office box in a forgotten corner of the Louisiana bayou. It had been 3 years since the medical board had stripped him of his license. 3 years since the words unethical and reckless had been branded onto his reputation like a hot iron. The patient, a young woman with a glioblastoma that had defied every conventional treatment, had been his last hope, his all-or-nothing gamble with a radical gene therapy of his own design. He had been so sure, so blindingly arrogant in his belief that he could outsmart death itself. The ensuing media firestorm had been merciless, painting him as a monster who preyed on the desperate. Now, his days were a monotonous cycle of cheap bourbon that burned its way down his throat and the suffocating weight of his failure. His fingers, once steady enough to navigate the most delicate of neural pathways, trembled as he broke the wax seal on the envelope. Inside, nestled in a bed of cotton, was a single, preserved leech, its segmented body a glossy, obsidian black. And beneath it, a letter penned in the familiar, spidery script of his former mentor, Dr. Alastair Finch. Alastair had been a giant in the world of oncology, a visionary who had always pushed the boundaries of medical science, a man who saw the rulebook as a mere suggestion. Then, a decade ago, he had simply vanished. The official story was that he had retired to pursue his passion for ethnobotany, but those who knew him whispered of a more dramatic departure, a falling out with the rigid establishment he had once championed, a dispute so profound it had erased him from the annals of modern medicine. Eris read the letter, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Alastair wrote of a discovery that would render the crude tools of chemotherapy and radiation obsolete, a fountain of youth, a cure for the cellular decay we call cancer. The words were grandiose, bordering on mad, but they were quintessentially Alastair. The letter was an invitation, a summons to his secluded research facility, a place where, he claimed, miracles were being born from the mud and murk of the swamp. Come, Eris, the letter concluded, and witness the dawn of a new age. With nothing left to lose and a sliver of his old, insatiable curiosity reawakened, Eris packed a small bag. The journey into the heart of the bayou was a descent into a world both beautiful and menacing. The further he drove, the more the asphalt gave way to gravel, then to a muddy track that threatened to swallow his rental car whole. The air grew thick with the scent of decay and damp earth, and the cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss, stood like ancient, skeletal sentinels guarding a forgotten realm. Eventually, the track became impassable. Following the letter's final, cryptic instructions, he abandoned the car and proceeded on foot, following strange markings carved into tree trunks. A prickling sensation ran down the back of his neck, the unnerving feeling of being watched, as if the swamp itself were observing him, judging his intrusion. The Finch estate was a relic of a bygone era, a once grand plantation house now surrendering to the relentless embrace of the swamp. Rust-eaten iron gates groaned in protest as he pushed them open. The paint peeled like diseased skin, the shutters hung askew, and thick vines clutched at the walls like skeletal fingers, actively trying to pull the structure down into the moist earth. Yet, there was a light burning in an upstairs window, a lone beacon in the encroaching twilight. Alistair Finch was waiting for him on the veranda. The years seemed to have recoiled from him. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, still held the same fiery intelligence Eris remembered. There was an unusual vitality about him, a youthful energy that seemed at odds with his age and the decay surrounding him. His skin, though lined, had a strange luster, and his handshake possessed a surprising sinewy strength. "Eris, my boy," he said, his voice a warm, resonant baritone that seemed to push back against the oppressive silence of the swamp. "I knew you would come." The days that followed were a whirlwind of revelations that shattered Eris's cynical worldview. Alistair's research was as audacious as his letter had promised. He led Eris to a makeshift laboratory in what had once been the ballroom of the old house. The juxtaposition was jarring. The ghosts of waltzes and laughter now replaced by the hum of machinery and the sterile scent of antiseptic. There, in a series of temperature-controlled tanks, were the leeches. Hirudo medicinalis obscura, Alistair called them, a rare, previously undiscovered species. The water in the tanks was unnaturally dark, and as Eris peered closer, he saw hundreds, perhaps thousands, of the glossy black creatures writhing over one another in a hypnotic, undulating mass. Alistair showed him the case files, detailed records of local people who had come to him riddled with cancer, their bodies wasted away by the disease and the brutal side effects of conventional treatments. And then he showed Eris the after pictures. The same people, their faces filled with color, their bodies strong and whole. The tumor scans were even more astounding. Eris, the disgraced scientist, felt his skepticism at war with the undeniable proof before his eyes. PET scans showed metabolic hot spots where tumors had once raged, now gone completely stone cold. It was impossible. The leech therapy, as Alistair termed it, was deceptively simple. The leeches were applied directly to the site of the tumor. They would attach themselves, and over the course of several hours, their saliva, a complex cocktail of enzymes and proteins, would be absorbed into the patient's bloodstream. "This enzyme," Alistair explained, his voice hushed with reverence as he held up a vial of the milky white saliva, "is the key. It's a targeted cytotoxin. It identifies and destroys cancer cells, leaving the healthy cells untouched. It's the silver bullet we've all been searching for." Eris, the jaded, disgraced scientist, found himself captivated. He observed the treatments, his initial revulsion at the sight of the writhing leeches on human flesh giving way to a grudging, fascinated horror. The patients spoke of a tingling sensation, a feeling of warmth spreading through their bodies as the leeches did their work. There was none of the nausea, the pain, the debilitating fatigue that came with chemotherapy. Alistair offered him a place at his side, a chance to be a part of this medical revolution. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, a chance to reclaim his purpose, to atone for his past sins. The cynicism he had carried with him into the bayou began to dissolve, replaced by a tentative, fragile hope. The chapter drew to a close with Eris standing by the bedside of a patient, a man with pancreatic cancer that had been deemed inoperable. The man's daughter, a young woman named Alara with eyes the color of the swamp at dusk, held her father's hand, her face a mixture of hope and fear. Eris watched as Alistair's assistant gently placed the leeches on the man's abdomen. The creatures, sleek and black, began their silent work. The sight was both mesmerizing and deeply, profoundly unsettling. A visceral shudder ran through Eris, a primal feeling that he was witnessing something ancient and far beyond the ken of human science. A strange and unholy dance of life and death unfolding before him. He was on the cusp of a miracle, or so he believed. The horrific truth, still slumbering in the murky depths, had yet to reveal its terrifying face. Eris immersed himself in the work with a fervor he thought he had lost forever. His days became a relentless cycle inside the makeshift laboratory, where the ghosts of extravagant waltzes seemed to watch him from the peeling walls. He became obsessed with isolating the miraculous enzyme in the leech's saliva. The science, however, was unlike anything he had ever encountered in peer-reviewed journals or the sterile labs of his old world. The molecular structure of the enzyme seemed to defy the very laws of biochemistry he had spent his life mastering. It was impossibly complex, a delicate, intricate web of proteins that appeared to actively adapt and change as he attempted to isolate it. It was like trying to capture smoke with tweezers. Every time he thought he was close, the structure would shift, rendering his separating agents inert. On one occasion, a concentrated drop of the saliva ate clean through a glass petri dish, leaving a hole as perfect as if drilled by acid, a thin, ozone-scented vapor rising from the breach. It was more than a chemical compound. It behaved as if it possessed a rudimentary will, an alien intelligence that fought his inquiries. Meanwhile, the patients continued to improve beyond the most optimistic projections. Thomas, Alara's father, the man with the pancreatic death sentence, was now able to sit on the veranda, finishing a hearty bowl of gumbo, his taste buds not numbed by chemotherapy for the first time in months. Beatrice, a woman whose ovarian tumors had riddled her pelvis, was now laughing, a full, strong sound that echoed in the halls, a sound that had been choked by weak coughs for years. They were living miracles, irrefutable proof of Alistair's genius. But amidst the chorus of praise and the mounting evidence of the leech's efficacy, a quiet, insidious unease began to creep into Eris's mind. There were inconsistencies, small, discordant notes in Alistair's symphony of miracles. First were the leeches themselves. They were guarded as if they were national treasures. Alistair was evasive when Eris questioned him about their breeding habits, their life cycle, or the provenance of this obscure species. The tanks in which they were kept were housed in a reinforced, windowless room secured by a heavy steel door with a complex electronic lock that only Alistair and two of his closest staff could open. A constant, unnatural chill seeped from beneath the door. One afternoon, seeing no one around, Eris tried the handle, only to find it immovable. Silas, one of Alistair's lanky, silent assistants, had appeared almost soundlessly behind him, his pale eyes cold and vacant. Dr. Finch prefers his sanctum undisturbed, he had stated, his voice a flat, emotionless monotone. It was a thinly veiled warning. And then there were the staff. They were a strange, insular group, their devotion to Alistair bordering on fanaticism. They moved about the estate with a languid, almost reptilian grace and rarely spoke, seeming to communicate with subtle nods and glances. Their skin had a deathly pallor, even under the harsh Louisiana sun, and their eyes seemed to rarely blink. Alara, in her quiet, watchful way, became Eris's only source of information about this bizarre world. She told him in hushed tones of the Crimson Bloom, an annual celebration held at the estate, a night of feasting and strange, secretive rituals from which outsiders like her were always excluded. She had also noticed changes in her father, changes beyond simple physical recovery. He was calmer, more withdrawn, sometimes looking at her with a hollow distance in his eyes that made her shiver. Alistair himself was an enigma. The vibrant, energetic man Eris had first encountered would, at times, succumb to a profound, bone-deep weariness. His skin would take on a sickly, translucent quality, the blue veins beneath visible like a river map. His voice would weaken to a reedy whisper, and he would retreat to his private quarters for days on end. When he emerged, the transformation was astounding. He would be reborn vibrant, his blue eyes once again burning with an almost unnatural intensity. He dismissed Eris's concerns as the burden of pioneering work, but Eris, a trained physician, knew that there was more to these episodes than simple fatigue. It resembled a life cycle, a decay, and a regeneration. The turning point came on a moonless night, the air thick with the chorus of unseen creatures. Eris, unable to sleep, his mind a whirlpool of unanswered questions, saw a flickering light moving through the trees at the edge of the swamp. Compelled by a mixture of dread and irresistible curiosity, he slipped out of the house, his footsteps muffled by the soft, damp earth. He followed the light, moving from tree to tree, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found Alistair and his most trusted staff at the edge of a murky, stagnant pool, a place the locals called the Devil's Eye and avoided, a place rumored to be bottomless. The air here was heavy and unnaturally silent. Even the chirping of the insects was hushed. What he witnessed next would forever be seared into his memory like a psychological brand. Alastair and his followers, disrobing, waded into the black, ink-like water, their faces upturned to the starless sky. Alastair began a low, guttural chant in an ancient, lilting language Eris had never heard. And then, from the depths they came. Leeches, far larger and darker than the ones in the laboratory, some as long as a man's forearm, rose like silent phantoms from the depths. They swarmed around the acolytes, attaching themselves to their willing flesh. There was no pain, no fear on the faces of the followers, only a kind of ecstatic surrender. Their eyes were closed, a bizarre, serene smile on their lips as their life force was drained. The water around them began to turn faintly pink. The feeding, as Eris would later come to call it, lasted for nearly an hour. When they emerged from the water, their bodies were drained and pallid as corpses. Yet their eyes held a look of rapturous contentment, as if they had just experienced a divine communion. Eris stumbled back to the house, his mind reeling in a vortex of horror and revelation. This was no research facility. It was a cult, and Alastair was its high priest. The leeches were not just a tool. They were an object of worship, ancient gods of the mire. The crimson bloom was not a celebration. It was a sacrifice, an initiation. The miraculous cure came at a price, a tribute paid in blood to the creatures they revered. The chilling realization that he was not a partner in a medical breakthrough, but a pawn in Alastair's monstrous game began to dawn, and the fragile hope that had taken root in his heart withered and died, replaced by a cold, terrifying certainty that he had stumbled upon a truth far more horrifying than any disease. The image of the ritual in the swamp was a cancer on Eris's mind, metastasizing through his waking hours and feasting on his sleep. The dream was always the same. He was submerged in the cold, inky water of the Devil's Eye, his limbs paralyzed, while the great, dark leeches swarmed him, their suckers latching onto his skin not with pain, but with a chilling intimacy. He could hear Alastair's guttural chant echoing from the shore, and he would awaken with a strangled gasp, the phantom sensation of being drained still tingling in his veins. The Finch estate, once a place of burgeoning hope, now felt like a beautifully constructed trap. Every shadow seemed to lengthen unnaturally. Every floorboard creaked with a sinister intent. The placid, unnerving calm of Alastair's staff now seemed predatory. He would catch Silas or the others watching him from a distance, their gazes flat and patient, like a crocodile waiting by the water's edge. They were no longer just devoted employees. They were guardians of a terrible secret, and Eris was now an unknown variable in their equation. His scientific mind, his last bastion of sanity, scrambled to rationalize what he had seen. A hallucinogen in the water? A bizarre form of group hypnosis? But he couldn't shake the visceral reality of it, the sight of Alastair's followers emerging pale and depleted, yet spiritually ecstatic. He knew he was beyond the edge of any known medical map. Driven by a desperate, clawing need for answers, Eris began a clandestine investigation. He had to know the truth behind the curtain. He started watching Alastair, meticulously charting his cycles of vibrant energy and deathly fatigue. He confirmed his suspicion. The periods of withdrawal always coincided with the dark of the new moon. It was during one of these episodes, when Alastair had retreated to his chambers and the house was sunk in a quiet torpor, that Eris made his move. His target was Alastair's private study, the one room that was always kept locked. He waited until the dead of night, when the only sounds were the hum of the swamp and the groaning of the old house. With a set of makeshift lockpicks fashioned from paperclips he'd pilfered from the office, he knelt before the study door. Every scrape of metal on metal seemed to echo through the mansion. His heart hammered against his ribs, and beads of sweat traced cold paths down his temples. After what felt like an eternity of agonizing tension, the lock clicked open with a soft, final thud. Slipping inside and closing the door behind him, he was hit by the smell of old paper, leather, and a faint, metallic scent like ozone or blood. The room was a shrine to Alastair's obsession. The walls were lined not just with medical texts, but with grimoires bound in cracked leather, books on alchemy, and forgotten anatomical treatises. On one wall hung a framed, hand-drawn chart depicting the nervous system of a leech, but it was interwoven with human ganglia in a grotesque, symbiotic pattern. On his desk, bound in worn, dark leather and secured with a small brass clasp, were Alastair's private journals. Eris's hands trembled as he opened the first volume. The early entries were written in Alastair's familiar, elegant script, detailing his initial genuine research. He wrote with the passion of a true scientist, marveling at the unique anticoagulant and anesthetic properties of the Hirudo medicinalis obscura. The enzyme, one entry read, is a miracle of nature. It doesn't just destroy cancerous cells. It seems to unwrite the error in their genetic code before triggering apoptosis. A perfect, targeted kill switch. But as Eris read on, the journals began a terrifying descent into madness. Alastair's scientific curiosity morphed into fanatical obsession. He described discovering that the enzyme was merely a delivery mechanism, a biological key that unlocked the host cells. The true miracle was what followed. "It is not a cure," Alastair wrote, his handwriting becoming more erratic, more slanted. "That word is too small, too primitive. The leeches are not a medicine. They are a vector. As they feed, they introduce a retrovirus of staggering complexity, carrying their own genetic material. It doesn't just kill the cancer. It replaces it. The host's DNA is slowly, inexorably rewritten. They are not being cured. They are being transformed." Eris felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He frantically flipped through the pages. Alastair wrote of the symbiosis with feverish glee. He documented the heightened senses, the accelerated healing, the incredible resilience to injury and disease in his followers, and in himself. He wrote of telomeres that no longer shortened, of cellular aging brought to a complete halt. He believed he hadn't just found a cure for cancer, but a cure for mortality itself. He saw it as the next stage of human evolution, a way to conquer the frailties of the flesh. The journals also revealed the terrible cost of this immortality. The symbiotic organism, this new hybrid tissue, was a voracious parasite. It required a constant supply of fresh, healthy blood to thrive and maintain the host. Alastair and his inner circle, the hosts, provided this sustenance to what he chillingly referred to as the mother colony in the swamp during the new moon feedings. Their periods of fatigue were the result of this constant, draining tribute. The Crimson Bloom was the final, terrifying initiation, a night when the new initiates, the cured patients, were fully integrated, their transformation sealed with a massive, ritualistic infusion of the leech's genetic material, binding them to the colony forever. Humanity is a flawed, dying design. The last entry in the current journal scrawled, "We are perfecting it. We are becoming eternal. We are the new gods of this world, born of the mud and the blood." The full, horrific scope of Alastair's deception was laid bare. He was not a savior. He was a monster creating a new species, a puppet master pulling the strings of the desperate and the dying, offering them life in exchange for their very humanity. Eris didn't even try to be quiet as he left the study. He stormed through the house, the journals clutched in his hand like a verdict. He found Alastair sitting in the grand drawing room, a glass of dark red wine in his hand, looking utterly refreshed from his recuperation. He looked up as Eris entered, a faint, serene smile on his lips, as if he had been expecting him. "You knew?" Eris breathed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disgust. "You knew I'd find out." Alastair didn't even attempt to deny it. He gestured to the armchair opposite him. "I have offered them a gift, Eris," he said, his voice soft and deceptively reasonable. "I have offered them life, a life free from the tyranny of disease and the indignity of aging. Is that so monstrous? You've lied to them. You've turned them into something else, something not human." Eris threw the journals onto the table between them. "They're just hosts for your swamp gods. Humanity is a terminal condition. Alistair countered, his eyes glowing with a feverish intensity. I have perfected it. Think of it, Eris. An end to death. An end to grief. A truly symbiotic relationship with nature itself. I am offering you the chance to join us, to be reborn. The offer hung in the air between them, a seductive, poisonous promise. For a fleeting, horrifying moment, Eris felt the pull of the lure of a life without the ghosts of his past, a life without the ever-present specter of his own mortality. But then he thought of Alara, of her father's vacant stare, of all the others who had come to this place seeking a cure, only to be unwittingly drawn into Alistair's biological cult. I would rather die, Eris snarled, his voice cold and hard. Alistair's serene smile finally vanished, replaced by an expression of profound disappointment. A pity, he said, his voice losing all its warmth, becoming as cold as the swamp at midnight. But the choice, I'm afraid, is no longer yours to make. He took a slow sip of his wine. Did you really think I would let you wander my home, my sanctuary, without taking certain precautions? The water you've been drinking, the food you've been eating. Even the very air in this house is seeded with what you need. A cold dread, far deeper and more terrifying than anything he had felt before, washed over Eris. He looked down at his own hands, half expecting to see his skin shimmering. The treatment, Alistair said, placing his glass down with a soft click, has already begun. Eris turned to flee, but Silas and another assistant were blocking the doorway, their forms silhouetted against the hall light. Their eyes, once merely vacant, now held the cold, unblinking focus of a predator. He wasn't a guest anymore. He wasn't a colleague. He was a specimen, a fly caught in a spider's web, and the spider was now ready to feed. The whisper of a miracle had become his own personal scream of terror. The days following the confrontation with Alistair were a living nightmare. Eris was confined to his room, a prisoner in the house of horrors he had once seen as a sanctuary. He was a patient now, his meals brought to him by the silent, unnerving staff. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the food was laced with the leech's saliva, the first step in his own forced transformation. He had to escape, not just for his own sake, but for Alara and her father, for all the others who were being slowly, unknowingly consumed by Alistair's monstrous cure. He found an unlikely ally in Alara. She had always been watchful, her quiet demeanor belying a sharp, intuitive mind. She had sensed the wrongness of the place, the subtle, unsettling changes in her father and the other patients. Under the guise of bringing him his meals, Alara became his conduit to the outside world. They communicated in whispers, in hastily scribbled notes hidden beneath his dinner plate. He told her everything, showed her the passages in Alistair's journals that he had managed to tear out before he was imprisoned. The horror in her eyes was a reflection of his own. Their plan was desperate, a long shot in a game where the odds were stacked impossibly against them. They would make their move on the night of the Crimson Bloom, the annual celebration that was, in reality, a ritual of mass transformation. The estate would be alive with a feverish, celebratory energy, a perfect cover for their escape. The night of the Crimson Bloom arrived, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and something else, something metallic and cloying. The grounds of the estate were lit with torches, their flickering light casting long, dancing shadows. The patients, dressed in white robes, moved through the celebration in a dreamlike state. They drank a deep, red wine, the nectar of the bloom, which Eris knew was a powerful sedative, designed to make them docile and compliant for the ritual to come. Eris had managed to pick the lock on his door using a piece of wire he had painstakingly pried from the mattress. He met Alara in a darkened hallway. Her face was pale, but her eyes were resolute. Their first task was to get to her father. They found him with the other patients, his eyes glazed over from the drugged wine. They managed to rouse him, to break through the chemical haze long enough for him to understand the danger he was in. Their escape was a chaotic, heart-pounding race against time. They created a diversion, setting a fire in the laboratory, the flames a beacon of their rebellion. In the ensuing confusion, They guided Alara's father and a handful of other patients who were still lucid enough to understand, towards the swamp, towards the boat they had hidden there. They were pursued by Alistair's followers, their movements no longer human, but a terrifying, fluid grace. They were strong, unnaturally so, their senses heightened by the symbiosis. The chase through the dark, treacherous swamp was a blur of tangled roots and grasping branches, the hoarse shouts of their pursuers echoing through the night. They reached the boat, but their path was blocked by Alistair. He stood at the water's edge, no longer the frail, elderly man Eris had known. He was transformed, his body radiating a terrifying power, his skin glistening with an iridescent sheen. "You cannot run from the future, Eris," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "This isn't the future," Eris yelled back. "It's an abomination." Alistair lunged, his speed and strength inhuman. He and Eris grappled at the edge of the swamp, a desperate struggle between man and monster. In the chaos, one of the large, black leeches from the swamp, disturbed by the commotion, latched onto Eris's arm. He cried out in pain and revulsion, tearing the creature off, but the damage was done. Alara, with a courage she never knew she possessed, struck Alistair from behind with an oar, sending him staggering into the dark water. They scrambled into the boat and pushed off into the night, leaving the Finch estate and its horrors behind them. As they disappeared into the darkness, Alistair's enraged scream echoed across the bayou, a promise of a reckoning that was yet to come. They had escaped the prison, but the poison was now inside Eris, a ticking time bomb, a horrifying reminder that the Leech's legacy was far from over. The world outside the suffocating confines of the Finch estate was a harsh, unforgiving place. Eris and Alara, along with the handful of patients they had managed to rescue, were met with a wall of disbelief and suspicion. Their story was too fantastical, too grotesque to be believed. The authorities, when they finally investigated the estate, found it abandoned. Alistair and his followers had vanished, leaving behind a laboratory filled with bizarre, unidentifiable biological samples and a lingering scent of decay. The cured patients, including Alara's father, were placed in a strict quarantine, their bodies a battleground for a war that medical science could not comprehend. The alien DNA that had been woven into their own was a medical anomaly, a terrifying new frontier in the study of infectious diseases. They were no longer simply cancer survivors. They were something else, something new and frightening. Eris, too, was a pariah. His past disgrace, coupled with his incredible story, made him an unreliable narrator in the eyes of the world. He was a man crying wolf, his warnings dismissed as the ravings of a madman. The bite on his arm, the point of entry for the Leech's poison, was a constant, throbbing reminder of his failure. He lived in a state of perpetual low-grade fear, a prisoner in his own body. He became obsessed with finding a cure, a way to reverse the transformation that he knew was slowly, inexorably taking place within him. He set up a makeshift laboratory in his small, squalid apartment, a pale imitation of the one at the Finch estate. He worked tirelessly, fueled by a desperate hope and the dregs of cheap coffee. He would spend hours staring at his own blood under a microscope, watching, with a horrified fascination, as the alien cells multiplied, their movements fluid and predatory. He was a living experiment, a walking, breathing testament to Alistair's monstrous vision. The nights were the worst. He would dream of the swamp, of the cold, black water, of Alistair's eyes glowing in the darkness. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the phantom sensation of the leech on his skin so real that he would frantically search his body for the creature. One evening, as he was staring into the mirror, he saw it. A faint, iridescent sheen on his skin, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the color of his eyes. It was the same transformation he had witnessed in Alistair, in his followers. The Leech's legacy was not just a memory. It was a living, breathing part of him. He thought of Alistair, of his talk of a new evolution, of a world free from disease and death. Had he been a monster or a visionary? Had he been trying to save humanity or enslave it? The lines, once so clear, were now blurred and indistinct. The story concludes on a note of chilling ambiguity. Eris, now a man teetering on the edge of a terrifying new existence, sits alone in his laboratory. A news report on the radio speaks of a series of unexplained disappearances in a remote, rural community, the details eerily similar to the area around the Finch estate. Alistair, it seems, has found a new flock, a new generation of desperate souls to welcome into his fold. Eris looks at his own reflection, at the stranger staring back at him, and a single, terrifying question echoes in the silence of the room. Has he truly escaped, or is he simply the next chapter in Alistair's horrific gospel, a reluctant apostle for a new and terrifying age? The camera zooms in on his eyes, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, they seem to glow with the same cold, inhuman light as the creatures of the swamp. The spine-chilling discovery was not just about a monstrous cure, but about the monster that now lived inside him.